Hello there, my sleepy travelers. Welcome once again to the comforting hush of twilight across the gentle lands of Middle-earth. Tonight, we begin beneath a soft lavender sky where the last light of day lingers upon the rolling green hills of the Shire, and the stars are just beginning to blink their sleepy eyes above. A breeze drifts gently through the tall grass, whispering through the hedgerows like an old friend. Lanterns flicker warmly from rounded windows nestled in the hillsides, and the faint scent of baked apples and wood smoke hangs in the air. Somewhere, a hobbit closes his book and leans back in a chair beside the fire, the creak of the floorboards echoing softly in his quiet home. But tonight, we will not stay long in the Shire. No, our path leads westward, beyond the Brandywine River, past the bustling lands of men and the golden woods of the elves, into the forgotten folds of the Blue Mountains, Ered Luin. There, in ancient stone and shadowed halls, whispers linger of dwarf kings and buried gold, of legends long hidden beneath the earth. So close your eyes now, dear listener, and take a deep, peaceful breath. Let us begin our tale gently and slowly. There once lived a hobbit, not far from the western edge of the Shire, where the roads narrowed and the hills grew wilder, kissed by pine and fog. His name was Halwyn Took, a gentle soul with eyes the color of twilight and a voice that rarely rose above a hum. He had a fondness for old maps, second breakfasts, and stories that lingered longer than they should. His neighbors called him thoughtful, the old gardener called him peculiar, but no one ever called him loud. Halwyn had inherited a tidy hill home from his uncle, round doors painted green, warm hearths, and windows that caught the last golden rays of each day. Yet what made the home truly his was a little study tucked under the eaves, where dust danced in morning light and shelves sagged beneath scrolls and brittle books. That's where Halwyn spent most of his time, tracing faded ink, copying odd runes into his notebooks, and turning pages worn thin by time and care. You see, Halwyn wasn't much for adventures, at least not the kind that required boots and bravery, but he had a quiet hunger for things forgotten. He liked to imagine where the rivers went after they left the maps, or what stories still slept beneath ruins too old for names. His favorite tales were always about the dwarves, tales of secret doors carved into mountainsides, of hidden forges lit by glowing ore, and of gold that hummed with ancient songs if one listened closely enough. One evening, as the sky blushed into lavender and the lanterns of the Shire blinked awake, Halwyn stood by his garden wall, holding a book older than his grandfather's memory. On the inside cover was a single line: "The caves beneath Ered Luin still breathe." No map, no signature, just a whisper from a time long past. That night, Halwyn couldn't sleep, not because he was afraid, but because something stirred within him, a gentle flutter, like leaves stirred by unseen wind. He felt it behind his ribs, in the hollow space where wonder lives. It was as if the mountains themselves had called his name, not with thunder or roar, but with a soft invitation carried by moonlight. So it was that Halwyn Took the quietest hobbit in the western hills packed a small bag filled with biscuits, ink, and one brass lantern, and set out not to find treasure or fame, but simply to listen, to follow the pull he did not understand into the heart of the blue mountains where the forgotten still waited, sleeping beneath layers of stone and silence. And so, our tale begins, not with haste or urgency, but with one quiet step taken on a mist-covered morning towards something ancient and softly glowing. There once lived a hobbit, not far from the western edge of the Shire, where the roads narrowed and the hills grew wilder, kissed by pine and fog. His name was Halwyn Took, a gentle soul with eyes the color of twilight and a voice that rarely rose above a hum. He had a fondness for old maps, second breakfasts, and stories that lingered longer than they should. His neighbors called him thoughtful, the old gardener called him peculiar, but no one ever called him loud. Halwyn had inherited a tidy hill home from his uncle, round doors painted green, warm hearths, and windows that caught the last golden rays of each day. Yet what made the home truly his was a little study tucked under the eaves, where dust danced in morning light and shelves sagged beneath scrolls and brittle books. That's where Halwyn spent most of his time, tracing faded ink, copying odd runes into his notebooks, and turning pages worn thin by time and care. You see, Halwyn wasn't much for adventures, at least not the kind that required boots and bravery, but he had a quiet hunger for things forgotten. He liked to imagine where the rivers went after they left the maps, or what stories still slept beneath ruins too old for names. His favorite tales were always about the dwarves, tales of secret doors carved into mountainsides, of hidden forges lit by glowing ore, and of gold that hummed with ancient songs if one listened closely enough. One evening, as the sky blushed into lavender and the lanterns of the Shire blinked awake, Halwyn stood by his garden wall, holding a book older than his grandfather's memory. On the inside cover was a single line: "The caves beneath Ered Luin still breathe." No map, no signature, just a whisper from a time long past. That night, Halwyn couldn't sleep, not because he was afraid, but because something stirred within him, a gentle flutter, like leaves stirred by unseen wind. He felt it behind his ribs, in the hollow space where wonder lives. It was as if the mountains themselves had called his name, not with thunder or roar, but with a soft invitation carried by moonlight. So it was that Halwyn Took, the quietest hobbit in the western hills, packed a small bag filled with biscuits, ink, and one brass lantern, and set out not to find treasure or fame, but simply to listen, to follow the pull he did not understand into the heart of the blue mountains where the forgotten still waited, sleeping beneath layers of stone and silence. And so, our tale begins, not with haste or urgency, but with one quiet step taken on a mist-covered morning towards something ancient and softly glowing. In the early mornings of the Shire's western edge, before even the rooster's crow broke the silence, Halwyn Took would rise quietly, the wooden floor beneath his feet creaking softly as if sighing in contentment. His cottage, nestled into the shoulder of a green hill, always felt warmer before the sun crested the horizon, as if it had kept some of yesterday's sunlight tucked away just for him. The scent of fresh dew drifted through the round window, mingling with the comforting aroma of chamomile and old parchment. Outside, the garden sloped gently into soft fog, where neat rows of marjoram, sage, and dwarf roses glistened with silver droplets. Halwyn always started his day here, barefoot among the thyme and moss, whispering good morning to the hedgehogs and bees who shared his quiet routines. He was a creature of gentle habit. After tea, always with honey and a crumbling biscuit, he would settle by his fireplace where a small table waited, already stacked with curled maps, notes, and tomes too delicate to open in haste. The hearth crackled lazily behind him, the flames casting soft amber light that flickered across ink and leather. Many in the Shire considered history to be something for scholars or brandybucks. But Halwyn believed history breathed. It didn't live in grand halls or under glass. It slept in tree roots and forgotten trails, in the symbols carved along well stones no one looked at twice. And most of all, he believed it whispered in stories, half-remembered songs hummed by grandmothers as they shelled peas, or in the tales the wind carried when it passed over ancient stones. It was on one such quiet morning, as he copied runes from a battered old scroll, that something unusual happened. Just as his quill touched paper, a faint tremor tickled the soles of his feet, so subtle, so fleeting, that for a moment he thought he'd imagined it. He paused, set the quill down, and listened. Outside, everything was still. No cartwheels on the road, no hammering from the distant smithy. Even the birds held their breath. He stepped to the garden path and looked westward, toward the hazy rise of the Ered Luin, the Blue Mountains. They stood distant and dreaming, dusted with morning mist, their peaks still kissed by starlight. They looked no different than before, yet something had changed. That afternoon, Halwyn took the longer way to market, a winding path that passed by the old standing stone near Hayward's Brook. It was a relic from another time, carved with runes no one could read, leaning just slightly, as if weighed down by years. Most folk passed it without a glance, but Halwyn always paused here, resting a hand on the cool surface. Today, however, he noticed something new. Fine moss, glowing faintly blue in the shaded side of the stone. He blinked, leaned closer. It pulsed, only once, like the beat of a hidden heart, and then faded. He did not speak of it to anyone. Instead, he spent that evening in his study, fingers tracing lines across his maps. He unfolded a parchment showing the western lands beyond the Shire, where winding paths became uncertain and names grew sparse. At the top corner, where the Blue Mountains rose from shadow, someone, perhaps his uncle or an older cartographer, had scribbled a note. There is gold in the breath of these hills, but not all gold glitters. That night, as Halwyn drifted to sleep beneath the soft blanket of cricket song and flickering lantern light, he dreamed of quiet places beneath the earth, of warm stone halls where songs echoed not in voices, but in the steady drip of water and the soft hum of metal waiting to be found. The next day was much the same, yet entirely different. He walked the garden paths, he fed the birds, he cleaned his spectacles thrice. But always, just beneath the surface of his thoughts, that subtle pull returned. It was not loud, it did not shout, it whispered, like a forgotten name on the edge of memory, a curiosity soft as breath that tugged his heart toward the west. On the third day, he found the book, tucked behind a loose stone in the hearth, a place he had dusted many times before, lay a small leather volume, its corners frayed, its binding worn soft with age. No title marked the cover, only a single rune etched into the flap. He opened it slowly. The script was old, flowing, and written in a hand far finer than his own. The first page read, "When the world was new and the stars still bright, the children of stone sang beneath Ered Luin. Their voices lit the gold, and the gold remembered." Halwyn's heart stirred. The pages that followed spoke not of battle or kings, but of songlines, paths the dwarves once followed, marked not with stone, but with resonance. Caves that opened only to those who carried no greed, whose hearts beat with wonder rather than desire. One line, nearly faded into invisibility, read, "In silence and stone there is memory. The cave listens for those who remember how to listen in return." The final page held a map, rough, barely more than scratches, but enough to hint at a trail from the Shire's western border toward the foothills of Ered Luin. Not a road, not even a path, but a rhythm, a suggestion. Halwyn didn't decide to follow it. He simply found himself preparing, as if some deeper part of him already had. He gathered only what he needed: a sturdy cloak, a quiet lantern, a notebook, and 3 biscuits wrapped in cloth. He left a note for Mrs. Bramble, his neighbor, to feed the robins while he was away. And as twilight folded the sky into soft purples and the first stars blinked awake, Halwyn stepped onto the soft earth path that wound westward. His feet moved gently, as if not to wake the hills. The map fluttered in his pocket. And just ahead, barely perceptible, the wind carried a hum, a low, resonant tone, like a song remembered by stone. He did not know what he would find, but the world had begun to stir in ways only he seemed to notice, and beneath that stirring was the breath of something old, something watching, something waiting. And so, with a quiet heart and a steady step, Halwyn walked into the dusk, not to chase glory, but to follow a whisper that spoke of gold not yet seen, and legends that had not yet finished being told. The path westward was not marked on any proper map, nor was it paved with stone or signposts. It curved like a gentle stream through fields of whispering barley, over sleepy brooks where frogs blinked slowly in the sunlight, and between ancient trees that had long forgotten the touch of many travelers. Halwyn moved with a quiet rhythm, his walking stick tapping lightly against the earth, his lantern swaying like a firefly in his hand, even during the day, just in case shadows grew too thick under the boughs. With each step, the world seemed to grow quieter, not in silence, but in attention, as though the hills and hedges had become listeners themselves, leaning in close to observe the small hobbit who had chosen to follow the call westward. The birdsong softened, The breeze moved slower, and even the crickets at night chirped in a kind of hush, as if not to disturb the old stories that still lingered in root and rock. It was on the third evening, as the sun dipped behind the far hills and the stars awoke one by one like old friends stretching in the dark, that Halwyn saw the first flicker of something unusual. At first, he thought it was simply a glowworm, nothing more than a pale green light weaving between the grasses. But it moved with strange purpose. It did not float, but dipped and rose, like it was tracing a path older than any memory. Halwyn followed it silently, footsteps muffled on moss and leaf. The glowing thread led him to a small hollow, rimmed with stone and sheltered by a copse of silver-barked trees. There, nestled beneath a fallen log, lay a small object, no bigger than a child's fist. A stone, perhaps, or a trinket carved long ago. It shimmered with a faint internal glow, like moonlight trapped in glass. Halwyn knelt beside it, not reaching out just yet. He let himself feel the space first. The air was warmer here, as though the earth beneath remembered the forge that had once shaped this thing. A hush rested on the clearing, and the trees did not sway. Even the stars above seemed to pause in their climb across the heavens, as if peeking over the edge of the world to see what the hobbit would do. At last, Halwyn reached forward and touched the object. It did not burn nor chill. It pulsed once beneath his fingers, just once, like a heartbeat, then stilled, but in that single pulse, a soft chime echoed in his mind. Not a sound heard by ears, but by memory. A note, a tone, ancient and steady, as though a hammer had struck a chord on the anvil of time itself. He wrapped the object gently in his handkerchief and tucked it away. That night, as he lay beneath a sky thick with stars, Halwyn did not sleep immediately. He watched the fire crackle in small, lazy flames and listened to the quiet hum that now seemed to linger beneath all things. It was not constant, nor loud. Just now and then, when the wind shifted or a cricket fell silent, he felt it. The resonance, the whisper of stone. On the fourth morning, he came upon the river. It wasn't marked on any of the maps he'd ever studied. It ran clear and cold, curling between stones black with age, and it sang to itself in a language that felt older than water. As Halwyn knelt to fill his flask, he noticed the river did not reflect the morning sky. Instead, it shimmered with stars. Startled but calm, he dipped his hand into the water. Ripples spread outward, and for a brief moment, he saw something beneath the surface. Not fish nor rock, but arches, pillars, a glimpse of a hall not built by hobbit hands. The vision faded as quickly as it had come. "Memory," he whispered. "The land remembers." That afternoon, the wind shifted. It brought with it the faintest sound, distant humming, deep and low, like a forge far beneath the earth. Halwyn paused on the trail, the stone object in his pocket suddenly warmer. He closed his eyes and listened. The hum was not just sound, but presence. It rolled through his bones like a lullaby made of thunder. He did not understand its meaning, but he felt its welcome, not as a visitor, but as someone remembered. He continued walking. That night, The forest opened into a clearing where no trees grew. In the center stood a single stone pillar, weathered, cracked, and covered in dwarvish runes half-eaten by moss. Halwyn approached slowly. The stone pulsed faintly beneath the moonlight, and the runes shimmered in places, revealing fragments of words. Gold hidden in harmony. Sung into silence. Listen, and the stone shall speak. Halwyn placed both hands upon the pillar and closed his eyes. At once, a vision bloomed behind his eyelids. He stood in a vast underground chamber, lit not by torches, but by veins of crystal singing with inner light. Dwarves moved quietly through the halls, not in clamor, but in reverence, their tools humming in harmony with the stone. In the center of the chamber stood a throne, carved not for a king, but for memory itself. Upon it lay the same glowing object, now tucked in Halwyn's pocket. The vision faded. He stepped back, the warmth of the stone still humming in his palms. He did not speak, he only sat by the pillar and watched the stars move slowly across the sky. In the days that followed, he encountered more signs. A songbird that sang in perfect thirds, echoing the same notes he'd heard in the river. A tree whose leaves shimmered gold only at dusk, as if catching light from another realm. And once, near twilight, a fox with silver-flecked fur walked alongside him for a while. It did not glance at him, it simply walked. And when it disappeared into the underbrush, Halwyn found a smooth stone at his feet, carved with a spiral so fine it looked like it had grown there. Every step west brought the mystery closer, but also gentler. The world was not hiding from him, it was guiding him. And within that guidance, something old was stirring, not in haste, but in harmony. He thought of the legends he'd read, of dwarves who had carved not only with chisels, but with songs, of caves that only opened when a certain chord was hummed into the silence, of gold not forged for wealth, but to remember, each ingot a vessel for stories too old for words. Now, as he neared the low hills at the edge of the Ered Luin, Halwyn felt that song growing clearer. He was no longer walking forward, he was walking inward, and the stone, nestled still in his pocket, pulsed like a tiny lantern in his hand. The mystery had grown, but not in fear, in wonder, and Halwyn, who had always listened to the world with quiet ears, now heard its music more deeply than ever before. Halwyn took awoke on the 6th morning to a sky of soft gray clouds, like wool pulled gently across the heavens. The earth beneath his bedroll was cool and springy with moss, and the trees around his little campsite swayed in unison, their whispering branches weaving a language older than any he'd ever studied. He stretched slowly, brushing sleep from his eyes, and sat with a small tin cup of tea cradled between his hands. The steam curled upward, catching the breeze and drifting toward the west, always west now. That direction had become more than a point on a compass. It felt like a quiet invitation. For days, the strange trinket he'd found, the smooth, glowing stone, had pulsed gently in his pocket. It didn't shine brightly, nor burn, nor behave with the bravado of magic from the old tales. Instead, it hummed softly, like it was remembering something or listening. That morning, as he continued his journey, Halwyn followed a narrow trail that wound its way between outcrops of blue-gray stone. Here, the hills of Ered Luin began to rise with more purpose. The air grew thinner, cleaner. Pines gave way to hardy brush and weather-worn granite, and birds called out with long, clear whistles that echoed between the ridges. After some time, the path curved along the edge of a ridge, revealing a small ledge that looked out over the valley below. Halwyn paused, catching his breath and taking in the wide, undisturbed expanse. And there, just at the edge of the drop, stood a stone arch. It was ancient, half buried, as though the mountain itself had tried to reclaim it. Vines grew through the cracks, moss spilled over the sides like green velvet, but the shape was clear, a doorway leading nowhere, or so it seemed. Halwyn stepped closer. As he neared, the stone in his pocket grew warmer, not with heat exactly, but with presence. It was responding. The archway bore no doors. Its inner curve was etched with runes so worn they could barely be seen, and yet, as he reached out and ran his fingers along them, they pulsed faintly beneath his touch, like waking embers in a long, cold hearth. Suddenly, the wind hushed. All around him, the world seemed to pause. Even the birds fell silent. And then, faintly, so softly it could have been imagined, a sound rose up from beneath the earth. It was not a voice, not words. It was tone, resonance, a deep, echoing note that seemed to come from far below, as though struck from a hidden bell inside the mountain. Halwyn stepped through the arch. At first, nothing happened. The ledge before him still fell away into open sky, but as he stood there, the stone beneath his feet shifted. No tremor, no crack, only change. He blinked, and where there had been only wild rock and cliff face, there now stretched a stone floor, worn smooth by centuries of footsteps. A hallway, sloped gently downward, opened before him, fading into darkness. The illusion had melted away like mist. The hidden caves of Ered Luin had revealed their edge. He did not hesitate. Lighting his lantern, Halwyn stepped forward into the dark. The tunnel curved slowly, its walls lined with ancient carvings. Dwarven in style, yes, but gentler than he expected, not sharp, not warlike. These were images of song, of hammers raised in harmony, of mountains giving way not in conquest, but in communion. Here and there, tiny crystals were embedded in the stone, catching the light and casting small rainbows across the floor. Deeper he went, and as he did, he began to hear it, the same tone from before, but now layered, soft chimes, deep hums, the delicate tap of tools not wielded by hands, but by memory. The caves were singing, not loudly, not even constantly, but in moments, as if breathing, and the deeper Halwyn walked, the more he could feel it resonating in his chest, like he too was becoming an instrument of the place. Eventually, he came to a chamber, not vast, not a grand hall, but a modest circular room, carved perfectly round, with a ceiling that domed like a sky and a floor of polished stone. In the center stood a pedestal, and upon it, something entirely unexpected, A harp. It was dwarven in make, yet slender and elegant, strung with what looked like strands of silver spider's silk. Time had not touched it. It looked as though it had only just been placed there. Halwyn approached slowly. As he neared, the stone in his pocket pulsed once more. The harp responded, its strings trembling as though touched by invisible hands. And then, one note rang out, clear, soft, and impossibly pure. Halwyn stopped, breath caught. Another note followed, then another. The harp was playing itself, slowly, gently, each note echoing in the chamber like water droplets falling into a still pool. Then silence, and in the hush that followed, Halwyn understood. The stone in his pocket, the one he had found in the woods, was not merely a trinket. It was a tuning key, a memory stone, a shard of ancient song. With trembling hands, he reached into his pocket, brought it forth, and placed it on the pedestal beside the harp. It shimmered once, then stilled, and with that, the chamber itself began to glow. Along the walls, hidden lines lit up, like veins of light moving through the stone. They formed shapes, images, words in dwarvish script. Here lies the voice of Aule, not in flame or fury, but in memory. These halls were carved for song, not war. Halwyn sat on the edge of the pedestal, tears brimming in his eyes. It was beautiful, and more than that, it was peaceful. He had not uncovered a lost weapon, nor a treasure hoard. He had found a memory, a promise, a space of stillness carved into the very bones of the mountain by those who once believed that song could shape the world as surely as steel. The harp played once more, 3 soft notes, a gentle lullaby, and Halwyn knew he was not alone, not truly. The dwarves who carved this place were long gone, but their voices still lived here, in crystal, in air, in resonance. He leaned back, resting against the smooth stone wall, lantern dimmed to a soft flicker. Above him, the dome sparkled with embedded stars, tiny flecks of quartz and gem arranged like constellations. He looked up and let the music carry him. He did not need to understand everything. Some mysteries were not meant to be solved, only listened to, only honored. And in the quiet, sacred heart of the hidden caves of Ered Luin, Halwyn listened, not as a scholar, not as an adventurer, but as a friend, and the mountains sang back. Halwyn did not leave the cave that night. He stayed, quietly nestled within the circle of memory and music, letting the gentle hum of the chamber settle into his bones. The harp's final notes had long since faded, but their echo lingered, not in the air but somewhere deeper, somewhere within. The pedestal, once glowing softly with the memory stone's light, had dimmed again, and the crystalline threads of the harp no longer danced in the air. All was still, as if the mountain had breathed a secret and then fallen asleep once more. Halwyn had no desire to disturb it. He sat with his back against the wall of the chamber, knees drawn up, lantern turned low. The stone beneath him was warm, not by heat, but by comfort, like it had been waiting for someone to sit there again. And above him, the dome of stars carved into the ceiling seemed to shimmer faintly, catching the last flickers of firelight like the reflection of constellations on water. He felt no fear, only quiet. And in that stillness, his thoughts turned inward. He remembered sitting beside his grandfather's hearth in Tookland, a small hobbit child with curly hair and wide eyes, listening to tales of ancient days. Not just about dragons and treasures and heroes, but about the dwarves who carved songs into stone, and elves who whispered to trees, and the soft sadness of things long forgotten. He had loved those stories. Even then, there had been something inside him, a tug, a longing for things he could not name, something beyond the hills, beyond the comfortable round windows of his family home. Not for adventure, precisely, but for meaning. And now, here he was, sitting in a secret hall beneath the blue mountains, listening to silence that was not empty, but full of memory, of intention, of songs made not for glory, but for keeping something sacred alive. He sighed gently, wrapping his arms around his knees, letting his breath match the rhythm of the sleeping cave. "I think," he whispered to no one at all, "I understand now." The mystery had never been about gold, nor was it about hidden power or treasure maps or the thrill of discovering something no one else had found. It was about remembering. The dwarves who carved this place had done so not to hoard, but to preserve, to honor a way of life that once breathed through every hall of Khazad-dûm, through every strike of the hammer, every shaping of stone. Their music had not faded, not truly. It had simply gone quiet, waiting for someone to listen again, and Halwyn had listened. As the night passed, he dozed in and out of sleep. When he awoke, he'd move to the mouth of the tunnel and sit, gazing out at the sky above the ledge. Morning in the mountains was different than in the Shire. Here, it came not with birdsong and dew, but with slow warming light creeping over the stone, pale gold, touching cliff edges and jagged peaks. The world felt taller here, more ancient. He watched the sun rise with a still heart. In the quiet of the morning, Halwyn took the memory stone from where it rested on the pedestal. It no longer pulsed with the same glow. It had offered what it held, shared what it remembered, but now it felt peaceful, like a book gently closed after a final chapter. He slipped it into the small pouch on his belt and stood, brushing the dust from his cloak. There was no dramatic ending, no blast of wind or sudden closing of doors. The cave simply remained as it was, still, sacred, and watching. He whispered a soft thank you to the stone and to the mountain, not expecting a reply, but feeling one nonetheless, somewhere beneath his feet. And then he walked. The path back through the mountain was easier this time, as if the rock had learned his steps and was guiding him gently. The tunnel's curves felt familiar, and he did not need the lantern. Light filtered in gently now, through seams and crystals, turning the walls to soft silver. By the time he stepped out beneath the open sky, the morning had fully arrived. The air was crisp, the trees rustled with calm, and the world felt changed, not because it had, but because he had. Halwyn sat once more on the ridge beside the stone archway. From here, the forest stretched out before him, and the Shire lay far beyond, past green hills and winding roads. He could return home. He would, in time. But for now, he lingered, letting his mind stretch over what he had seen. what he had felt, what had awakened in him. A realization had dawned, quiet and certain. The tales of Middle-earth were not just about battles and crowns. They were not only the stories of kings and warriors, of elves and rings and fire. They were about keeping light alive, even when hidden, even when forgotten, in songs buried beneath stone, in hearths lit in quiet homes, in the steady rhythm of a hobbit's heart, listening, truly listening, to the mountain's song. He smiled. Perhaps he would tell someone one day, not the full story, not the secret of the cave. That was not his to give away, but he would tell the heart of it, that peace could be found in forgotten places, that sometimes the quietest paths led to the deepest truths, and that the mountains still sang, if only one knew how to listen. He stood finally and began the slow walk down the ridge trail. As he moved, the wind picked up softly, catching the edge of his cloak. It carried with it the scent of pine, of old stone, and something else, something older. He paused and looked back once more toward the stone archway. The vines swayed gently. The path was as it had been before, but now he knew, and that knowing warmed him more than any fire ever could. The sun rose higher, and Halwyn took, Hobbit of the Shire and quiet keeper of a song not his own, walked softly onward, back into the world that would never quite look the same again. For he had glimpsed the memory of gold not in coin, but in resonance, and in his heart a harp still played. The trail that wound away from the Blue Mountains was an old one, barely visible in some places, swallowed by moss and time, but it had a rhythm to it, a soft meandering that led Halwyn through pine-shadowed glades, over quiet brooks, and beneath skies that seemed painted for peace. He walked without hurry. His feet met the earth with the ease of someone who had nowhere urgent to be and everywhere sacred to walk. The stone of the memory cave rested securely in the pouch on his belt. It no longer glowed, yet somehow it seemed to hum gently, as though it liked being close to a heartbeat again. Halwyn felt lighter than he had in years. Not exuberant, just right. That morning, the birds had stayed quiet longer than usual, not with fear, but with reverence, as if they too had listened to the cave's silent harp and knew that the world deserved stillness sometimes. By noon, the air warmed and shimmered in the leaves. Halwyn paused beneath an old elm, letting the soft shade embrace him. He had just taken a sip from his flask when he heard a rustle, not sharp, not alarming, just the quiet sound of someone else walking the world. And then came a voice, low, steady, touched with music. "Mind if I share your shade, traveler?" Halwyn turned to see a tall figure, robed in gray-green, with a staff of twisted yew and a hood that shadowed their face. For a heartbeat, Halwyn's breath caught, but the stranger smiled, and there was kindness in it, worn and weathered like the bark of old trees. "Of course," Halwyn said, shifting to make space on the mossy stone. The traveler settled beside him with a sigh. They sat in companionable silence for some time, watching light trickle through the branches like golden syrup. "You've come from the mountain," the stranger said, not as a question, but a knowing. Halwyn nodded. "I've heard her song," he replied softly. The stranger smiled, eyes half closed. Few listen anymore. Fewer still understand. Halwyn felt no need to explain. He sensed that this traveler, whoever they were, already knew the shape of things. After a while, they spoke again. There was a time when dwarves sang not just of gold, but of memory. They believed the stone could keep the voices of the past alive. Halwyn glanced at the pouch by his side. I think they were right. The traveler tilted their head. And what will you do with what you heard? The question settled like dust on a quiet shelf. I think I'll remember, Halwyn said, and maybe remind others how to listen. The stranger gave a slow, approving nod. Then, as softly as they'd arrived, they stood and stretched. Before departing, they offered Halwyn a small token, an acorn etched with a single rune, older than even the oldest Hobbit lore. Plant this where memory feels thinnest, the traveler said. It will grow. And then they were gone, melting into the green like a shadow softened by sun. Halwyn sat for a while longer, turning the acorn in his palm. It was warm. Later that day, he followed the trail down toward a bend in the hills, where the trees parted to reveal a glade so serene it felt untouched by time. There, beside a silver-barked tree, stood another figure, this one small, quiet, with hair like white smoke and eyes like still water. She was sitting on a stone, humming faintly, as if to herself. Halwyn paused at the edge of the clearing. The figure looked up and smiled. You've been where few go, she said softly. Halwyn nodded. The woman patted the moss beside her. Then come sit. The wind carries questions. He did. They sat together as the breeze stirred the long grasses, whispering secrets that only those who waited long enough could understand. I once walked those halls too, she said, long ago, when the song still echoed. You're a dwarf? Halwyn asked, blinking. The woman chuckled, a sound like gravel softened by velvet. Was, or something near enough. I left the halls before they fell quiet. I carry their memory in me. They shared stories for hours, small ones, not the kind written in great tomes, but quiet tales of stone polished by hand, of lullabies sung to cave-born children, of laughter that echoed even louder than anvils. I thought I was the only one who cared to remember, Halwyn confessed. The woman reached out and touched the pouch at his belt. You're not alone. You're part of a long line of lanterns passed hand to hand. When they parted, she gave him a tiny braid of silver wire, twisted into the shape of a listening ear. Hang this near your hearth, she said, so you never forget that stories are meant to be heard. As evening came, Halwyn made camp by a stream. The stars blinked to life, one by one, above him. He didn't light a fire. Instead, he listened to the rustle of leaves, the song of water over stone, the distant hoot of an owl with no name, and beneath it all, like the softest bass note, the slow, steady hum of a memory still alive. He held the silver braid in one hand, the runicorn in the other. He thought of all he'd seen, and those he'd met, the traveler with the staff, the old dwarf woman who remembered joy. None had given him answers. Only presence, only small reminders, and that, he realized, was all that was needed. Sometimes You didn't have to solve a mystery. Sometimes you only had to carry it forward, as gently as a story told by firelight, as softly as a step along a mossy path, as reverently as a song passed from stone to heart. And so, Halwyn Took, the quietest Took, the one who liked fireside tea and old maps, lay back in the grass, watching stars swirl above the pines. And somewhere behind his closed eyes, a harp began to play once more, not in echo, but in belonging. That night, as Halwyn Took wandered beneath the velvet sky, the stars above seemed to pulse with memory, not light. He had walked the winding woodland trail until his legs asked for rest, and now, on a soft bed of moss near a ring of old stones, he sat with his knees tucked to his chest, the silver braid from the old dwarf woman resting in his palm like a keepsake from a dream. The glade was quiet, save for the sleepy hush of wind moving through pine needles and the low, burbling song of a brook not far off. It was a perfect place for remembering. He was not alone tonight. Across the flickering light of a small fire, built carefully in a pit of smooth stone, sat a figure cloaked in twilight gray. The same traveler he'd met days earlier, the one who'd spoken in riddles and offered him the rune-carved acorn, had returned as silently as they'd first appeared. Now, their voice came slow and low, like an old stream freed from the winter's grip. "Do you know," they said, turning a flat stone in their palm, "that long before the dwarves carved the first halls in Ered Luin, this land sang with tales?" Halwyn shook his head. The traveler smiled, tapping the stone gently against the fire's edge. "They say that once the mountains had no names, only moods. Some nights they whispered, others they watched, but always they remembered." Halwyn leaned forward, eager despite himself. "Tell me one." And the tale began. It was of Durla the Hollow Ear, a dwarf maiden born in the First Age who could hear the heartbeats of stone. When she pressed her ear against a cavern wall, it sang to her, not in words, but in colors, in memories. And so, she mapped the caverns not with pickaxe, but with harp string. Her music led her people to the richest veins of silver and mithril, not because she sought wealth, but because she followed sorrow. "They say," the traveler said, "she once wept for a stone that had forgotten its name, and her tears awakened a lode so pure it glowed even in darkness." Halwyn closed his eyes and saw her, small, silent, pale against the shadows, singing to sleeping rocks like a mother humming lullabies to a drowsy child. As the fire crackled, the traveler continued. Another tale, this time of Thalin the doorkeeper, a dwarf who never left his post. Not once. For 500 years, he sat beside the western gate of an ancient city now lost, not to guard it, but to remember it. After the city fell to time and silence, Thalin remained, speaking each night to the wind, reciting the names of those who had once passed through. "Even after death," the traveler murmured, "they say his voice lingers in the pass, whispering the names to the stars, so they too would remember." Halwyn shivered, but not from cold. It was the shiver of belonging, the sense that he was part of something older, deeper, and far more beautiful than he'd ever imagined. Then came a third story, told not by the traveler, but by the wind itself. As the fire settled low, Halwyn heard it, a voice too old for language, brushing across the tall grass like a sigh. He looked up. The stars pulsed brighter. The traveler tilted their head, listening. She comes. From the woods emerged a new figure, tall, regal, and bearing a glow not of firelight, but of starlight. An elf, ancient beyond measure, her hair silver as moon-washed snow. She carried a staff, crowned with a single pearl that shimmered gently. Halwyn rose respectfully. "You found those stone," she said softly, eyes meeting his. "And it has found you," he nodded. "I heard the cave's harp." The elf smiled. "Then it is time you knew why." And so she sat beside him, and with the fire now only embers, began her own tale. "In the days before the sun rose," she began, "when starlight was the only lantern for the world, the dwarves and elves did not yet know mistrust. In secret, they gathered in the hidden places, in glens veiled by mist, in grottos beneath roots, and shared stories." She touched the ground gently. One such place was beneath Ered Luin, a cavern of such stillness that even time hesitated to pass. There, the dwarves taught the elves how to listen to stone, and the elves, in return, taught the dwarves to dream in stars. Halwyn breathed slow. "They made a pact," she said, "to bury their greatest memories together in a harp, strung not with wire, but with breath and silence." A long pause. "But memory is fragile, and as the world changed, the cavern was lost, until now." Halwyn looked at his pouch. The harpstone rested there. The elf rose. "You must plant the acorn soon," she said, her voice like wind through reeds, "and sing when you do. Only then will the dream return." And then, without sound or rustle, she vanished. The traveler stood, offering Halwyn one last glance. "She was one of the last to walk that road," they said. "You may be one of the first to walk it again." Halwyn sat for a long time after. The fire was ash now. The stars still watched, and he knew, deeply, gently, that he carried more than a story. He carried a remembering, and in that moment, he swore softly and without ceremony that he would pass it on, not in books, not in speeches, but in quiet firelight, in shared starlight, in listening, always listening, and in a world that was forgetting, he would be the one who remembered, just like the stones, just like the stars. As dawn approached on the edges of the old forest, the air grew still, not cold, though the dew clung to the moss and kissed the leaves, but quiet in the kind of way that made even the robins hush their morning song, as if the world itself was holding a breath it had waited many ages to exhale. Halwyn awoke slowly beneath the ancient pine, the embers of the last night's fire barely glowing. The silver braid from the dwarf matron lay tucked against his chest, and beside it, the rune-marked acorn hummed with a subtle warmth. It wasn't loud or glowing or grand, just present, as if it had a heartbeat now, slow and steady. He rose, brushing leaves from his sleeves, and looked west. The path was no longer hidden. What had once been a faint trail beneath root and fern now shimmered faintly in the morning light, as if the dew itself outlined it in silver. It wound up into the misty hills of Ered Luin, where few hobbits ever dared to go. But Halwyn, small, thoughtful, quiet Halwyn, had long stopped fearing the unknown. He was learning that the unknown had been waiting for him. He walked the path in silence. The wind followed him gently, whispering not words, but comfort, brushing his cheek like a mother's hand. As the trees thinned and the stone faces of the blue mountains rose tall and ancient before him, the sky turned pale gold, then silver, then softly gray, as if morning could not bear to intrude too loudly on what was to come. And then he saw it, tucked into the base of a high ridge, hidden beneath ivy and stone, was an arch of ancient dwarven make. Not the grand, glittering halls of legend, no gold or banners here, just stone, weathered, quiet, and sure. The entrance was shaped like a harp, two curving pillars with a lintel that mimicked strings, though none remained. Halwyn stood still. He touched the braid. He pressed his hand against the stone door. It opened, not by force nor magic, but by recognition, as if the cavern remembered him, or the part of him that carried the stories. Inside, it was utterly still. The darkness was not frightening. It was deep, like velvet, and smelled faintly of earth and metal and old moss. As he stepped forward, the faintest glow bloomed from the acorn in his pouch, casting warm gold light ahead. The walls shimmered, not with jewels, but with veins of memory, minerals that shifted as he passed, reflecting images like mirrors behind fog. He passed carvings of Durla, the hollow ear, harp in hand, her eyes closed and listening, her story etched in rune and curve, showing her tears mingling with mithril veins. He passed Sickensbeans of Thalin the doorkeeper, seated eternally at his post, whispering names into the wind that flowed through carved tunnels. And deeper still, Halwyn walked until the cave opened into a vast chamber. It took his breath. Above him, the ceiling curved high and domed, inlaid with thousands of tiny crystals that shimmered in constellations, not random, but familiar. They matched the sky, the stars, as they had once been before the rising of the sun. And below that ceiling, the cavern floor sloped gently to a pool of still water, and at its center stood the harp. Not a harp of strings, a harp of silence. It was carved from stone so fine it shimmered like pearl, its frame wide enough to hold the air between its arms. And in that silence, the entire chamber seemed to listen. Halwyn stepped forward. He placed the acorn in a small hollow at the harp's base, and then, slowly, without music, he began to speak. Not grand words, not songs of power, just names: Durla, Thalin, the dwarf matron with silver hair, the nameless traveler who guided him, the elf who came with the stars, and then his own name Halwyn took. As he spoke, the crystals above flared gently, like candle flames responding to each memory. The air began to hum, not loudly, but with the warmth of breath. The pool shimmered, reflecting not the cave, but moments, memories of the stories he'd carried. And then the harp sang. It was not music as hobbits knew it. It was deeper, Slower, it sounded like the heartbeat of the mountain itself, old, kind, and full of sorrow and joy in equal measure. Halwyn wept, not from sadness, from relief. The cave was not empty, it remembered. He sat then for a long time, perhaps hours, perhaps days. No hunger touched him, no fear or cold, only calm, only the sense that something long slumbering had opened its eyes, seen him, and returned to sleep at peace. When he left the cave, the acorn was gone. In its place, a small sprig of silver-leaved sapling had risen beside the harp, its roots warmed by the remembering stone. The path down the mountain was gentle, the sky now clear. He met no one on his descent, though the birds watched him quietly, and the wind bowed through the trees like an old friend. By the time he returned to the Shire, nothing had changed, and yet everything had. The ivy still curled around his garden gate. The teapot still sat warm on his hearth, but inside him the harp still sang. And sometimes, on quiet nights when the wind comes from the west and the stars burn a little brighter, Halwyn took will sit by the fire and tell stories, not from books, but from the stones, not for glory, but for memory. And every now and then, a dwarf traveler, old and weary, will pause at his gate, place a hand over their heart, and nod, for they too have heard the harp, and they too remember. And so the caves of Ered Luin remain hidden, not because they are lost, but because they are waiting for hearts gentle enough to listen, just as Halwyn did, just as you perhaps will one day too. Hello again, my gentle listener. If you're still with me, eyes growing heavy and thoughts wrapped in the soft folds of mist and memory, let us take a final breath together, slow and deep. The journey has been long, but never hurried, and now the road grows quiet once more beneath your feet. You've walked beside Halwyn Took, that humble hobbit of curious heart, from the quiet paths of the Shire to the ancient caverns beneath Ered Luin, through whispers in the trees, glowing paths through forgotten woods, and echoes in mountain halls that have not heard names spoken in an age. And you've heard the mountain remember, not with thunder, but with stillness, not with gold, but with legacy. And perhaps, just perhaps, you've remembered something of yourself too. Not something loud or urgent, but soft, like a note from a harp with no strings, a pull that speaks to wonder, to memory, to stories untold, the kind of truth that doesn't shout, but hums in the quiet moments between heartbeats, the kind of magic that lives not in spells or swords, but in listening. Because here in Middle-earth, long after the trumpets have faded and the great battles passed into legend, there are still stories like Halwyn's, quiet, slow, and full of meaning. Stories that live in moss-covered stones and the corners of old maps, in songs half sung by rivers and dreams carried on the breeze. And now, your part in the story is ending, for tonight at least. Let your thoughts settle like leaves upon still water. Let the hush of Ered Luin rest on your shoulders like a warm shawl. Let the echo of that ancient harp hum softly in your heart, lulling you into the gentlest sleep. You are safe now. You are home. The wind through the trees, the crackling of a distant fire, the silver thread of starlight weaving through your dreams. They are all here to watch over you as you drift off, as you too follow the westward road into quiet rest. So sleep well, my sleepy traveler. Sleep well and dream of the dwarves' forgotten gold, of silver-leafed saplings, and the songs sung by mountains in their slumber. The road will still be here when you wake. And until then, may peace find you in every shadow, and may every shadow hold a story waiting to be remembered. Good night.